you have emotional systems that help you decide whether you're on the right path. Because if you have to do things, you're on a path. And if you're going somewhere, you better be on the right path. And so then you need something to tell you whether or not you're on the right path. And that's what your emotions do. Your positive emotion and your negative emotion. They're orienting systems that tell you whether you're on the right path. And the path is defined by the goal. So you need a goal. So that's the first thing to think about. It's really, 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 really important to think about this. If your life is not the way you want it to be, it's possible that your goal is not what it should be. And that's a fundamental religious teaching, by the way. I would say that might be the fundamental religious teaching of Buddhism. Right? Because the Buddhists teach in some sense that everything is Maya or illusion. And it's a complicated idea. But partly what it means is the way the world manifests itself to you is in large part determined by your aim within the world. And so by switching aim, you can switch whether something is positive or negative. And so put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Well, so what's the idea? It's like, well, if the world isn't up to your standards, let's say, first of all, you might ask yourself about that to begin with. It's like, the world isn't up to your standards. Really? That's the world's problem somehow. It's not more likely that it's, given that you're talking about the world here, it's not more likely that there's some chance that it's your problem. And that if you put yourself right, then the world wouldn't appear to be a problem. You know, knowing that your emotional reactions are dependent on your aim, and that that's actually technically true, does immediately open up the question, hey man, if things aren't laying themselves out in front of you, the way that is necessary for you to live a full and engaged life and not be cynical and bitter and twisted and cruel and vengeful and disappointed and all of that, it's just possible that you're not aiming at the right thing. And man, that is a question worth asking. Well, it's a question people do ask. It's like, well, what's the purpose of life? Well, it's the same question. What should I aim at? Those are the same questions. And, you know, if what you're aiming at is producing nothing but unrequited misery for you and everyone else, and it's a downhill bloody spiral into something approximating hell, then there is some possibility that you should think that perhaps your aim is off.
One of the times in your life when you actually realize that you're an individual is when you'll go and ask your parents something and you'll realize they actually don't know any more about what you should do than you do. And that sucks. And that's partly why people are often willing to maintain a tyrant-slave relationship with their father. It's like, on the one hand, you have to be inferior in a relationship like that. You know, you've always got the judge watching you. But on the other hand, there's always someone who knows what to do. There's always someone standing between you and the unknown that you can go ask, what should I do? Well, at some point, you'll realize that the reason you can't ask that anymore is because they actually don't know any more than you do. And then that's a pain, like that is a symbolic death. And that's also when you establish a more individual relationship with your parents. It's at that point that you could conceivably start taking care of them instead of the reverse. And that's a time that should come. But you have to let that image of perfection go. And that exposes you. And so, you know, that's also the case that once you hit a certain point in your development, the answers that you're looking for are not going to be found in your parents' house. It's as simple as that. Now, you could artificially maintain your dependency, but, you know, if you do that for too long, things get pretty ugly. So you get pretty stale and you know, you're like bread that's been on the shelf for too long. When you orient your vision, different things appear to you in the world. So, and I mean this literally. So, because you can't see everything, your vision calculates what's necessary, your brain calculates what's necessary for you to see so that you get to the point that you're aiming at. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean it literally. Things that aren't relevant to what you're seeking, you won't see them unless they get in your way. And they have to really block your pathway before they'll be literally visible. So you orient yourself towards something, and that makes some things visible that wouldn't be visible and makes other things invisible that you might have seen. And so when you change your orientation, what manifests itself in the world also changes. Now, I had a structure that was orienting me properly in relationship to the world. And as far as it was embodied in my actual father, it's now gone. Is there any possibility that I can find that again? And that is what you want. You see, like if you're in a chaotic circumstance, maybe you've escaped, let's say, from a bad relationship or something like that, and you're out of it, but now you don't know what to do. What you're hoping is that you can get your life back together, right? That you can put the pieces that have fallen apart back together. And so you're automatically going to generate a fantasy about producing another, let's call it stable state. You're going to be looking for the spirit that would enable that stable state to be generated. Because really what it is, in some sense, is your new personality. You're in chaos, you have to become something new in order to get out of chaos. And so you're hoping for that, you're hoping that you'll see it. And so that's going to make certain things visible to you. That's the proper way of thinking about it. You know, when you get curious about something, and maybe you're curious about something and you walk into a bookstore, that curiosity is going to guide you to a certain set of books. The fact that you have the question in mind is going to open your eyes to certain kinds of possibilities. And so if your goal is to reestablish your union with the positive father, let's say, then certain things are going to appear and other things aren't. And that's really what this represents. The transcendent star is the goal. It's capable of, let's say, delivering a message to you. In some sense, that's what's happening when you're thinking, you know, because you have a problem you want to solve, you have somewhere you want to go with your thoughts, and as a consequence of that, information reveals itself to you in the interior landscape. It's a very strange thing. You know, in some sense it feels as if you're producing the thoughts, but it could equally be said that you're watching the thoughts reveal themselves. And which of those is the more accurate description is by no means obvious. You can certainly have thoughts that surprise you, which is very strange. It's like, they're your thoughts. How in the world can they surprise you? But they do. So it's like you didn't know them before you thought them up. And then the question is, well, where did they come from if you didn't know them before you thought them up? You want to present yourself to the world in a manner that doesn't disgrace you in some sense. That might be a good way to think about it. And you don't want to disgrace yourself because the consequence of disgrace is emotional dysregulation. More pain, less positive emotion. And so the best way to present yourself is to stand up forthrightly and to stretch out, you know, and to occupy some space, and you make yourself sort of vulnerable by doing that because you open up the front of your body, right? But it's a sign of confidence, and that way people are most likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. And that's a good way to start regulating your mood. But not only does it directly regulate your mood to stand up, because it's so tightly associated, like postural flexion is associated with serotonin and emotional regulation, but also because if you straighten up and you present yourself in that manner, then other people are more likely to take you seriously. And that's another way that you can at least give yourself the bloody benefit of the doubt, right? And confront the world in a courageous manner. And that's a really good way of figuring out how to establish yourself in multiple competence hierarchies, because one of the general rules of thumb about how to be successful is to confront things that frighten you forthrightly and with courage. And that's kind of a universal strategy for success. See, I read this piece of work by Jung a long while back, and it was a meditation on the injunction to treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated, something like that. And what Jung pointed out, which I really liked, was that wasn't an injunction to be nice to other people. It was an invitation to reciprocity. It was something like this. It's like, you should figure out how you would like to be treated, like you were taking care of yourself, not how you would like people to respond to you. It's more important than that. And the Lord said unto Abram, and this is the opening of the story, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And this is one of those phrases where every clause is significant. Go somewhere you don't understand. That's the first thing. Get thee out of thy country. You know, back in the 1920s, there was a whole slew of American writers who ended up as expatriates in Paris, Hemingway among them, and then a variety of others. It was very inexpensive in Paris at the time, and part of their transformation into great literary figures was the fact that they were out of their country, and now they could see what their country was, because you can't see what your country is until you leave it. So you have to go into the unknown, and that's God's first command. Go into the unknown, because you already know what you know. And that's not enough unless you think you're enough. And if you're not enough and you don't think you're enough, then you have to go where you haven't been. And so that's the first commandment to Abraham. It's like, okay, that's a good one. That makes perfect sense. Go to where you don't know. Yes. And from thy kindred. Well, what does that mean? It means grow up. That's what it means. It means get away from your family enough so that you can establish your independence. And that isn't because there's something wrong with your family, although perhaps there is, as there is perhaps wrong with you. I talk to people very frequently whose families have provided them with too much protection. And they know it themselves, and that means they're deprived of necessity. One of the things that you see in the United States, for example, is that the children of first-generation immigrants often do better than their children. And the reason for that is that the children of first-generation immigrants have necessity driving them. And you don't know how much you need necessity to drive you, because maybe you're not very disciplined. And if a catastrophe doesn't immediately befall you if you don't act forthrightly today, then maybe you never act forthrightly, right? Because the gap between your foolishness and the punishment is lengthened by your unearned wealth, and so you never grow up and learn, and you have to get yourself away from your dependency in order to allow necessity to drive you forward. And that's to become independent and to become mature. And so you get away from your country, and you get away from your kin and from your father's house, right? And you go out there and you establish yourself in the world. It's a call to adventure. That's what the first lines in the Abrahamic story is, a call to adventure unto a land that I will show you. And one of the things that Jung understood and the psychoanalysts understand, it's one of the most terrifying elements of psychoanalytic thinking. It's very tightly allied with religious thinking, which is that you are not the master of your own house. There are spirits that dwell within you, meaning you have a will and you can exercise a certain amount of conscious control over your being, but there are all sorts of things that occur within you that seem to be beyond your capacity to control. Your dreams, for example, that's a really good example, or your impulses, for example. You might think of those as so foreign from you that you don't even want them to be part of you. But more subtly even, how about what you're interested in, what compels you? Like, where does that come from? Exactly. Because you can't conjure it up of your own accord, So if you're a student and you're taking a difficult course, you might say to yourself, well, I need to sit down and study for 3 hours. But then you sit down and that isn't what happens. Your attention goes everywhere. And you might say, well, whose attention is it then if it goes everywhere? Because you say it's your attention. It's like, well, if it's your attention, maybe you would be able to control it, but you can't. And so then you might think, well, Jen, just exactly what the hell is controlling it? And you might say, well, it's random. Well, it better not be random. I can tell you that. That happens to some degree in schizophrenia. There's an element of randomness in that. It's not random. It's driven by the action of phenomena that I think are best considered as something like subpersonalities, although even that's only a partial description. You can't make yourself interested in something. Interest manifests itself and grips you. That's a whole different thing. And so what is it that's gripping you? And how do you conceptualize that? Is that a divine power? Well, it's divine as far as you're concerned, because it grips you and you can't do anything about it. And so there's a calling in you towards what you're compelled by and what you're interested in. And sometimes that might be very dark and sometimes not. But you're compelled forward by your interest. And so the idea that what moves you away from your country and your father's house and the comforts of your childhood home is something that's beyond you and that you listen to and hearken to. That's exactly right. And you can say, well, I don't want to call that God. It's like, it doesn't matter what you call it exactly. It doesn't matter to what it is, what it's called. It still is. Why people don't like themselves very much. And I think there's two reasons really. And one is that we're fragile and damageable and imperfect in multiple dimensions all the time. And that often just gets worse. Lots of things get worse as you get old, for example. So it's not necessarily that easy for a self-conscious being who's extraordinarily aware of his or her own foolishness and errors. Like, you know yourself better than anyone else knows you. And, you might have a certain amount of dislike for someone you know because of something they did. But you know everything you did.
Jesus, that's a drag, man. You know, you have to carry that along behind. It's like, really, I did that, you know? And then, so there's that. It's like you're weak and kind of useless and prone to temptation. And you know all those things, you know, that just shouldn't be that way. And then you're also capable of pretty vicious acts of malevolence. And so you also know that about yourself. And so it's a real existential question for people. It's like, why the hell should you take care of something as sorry and wretched as you are? First of all, yes, you're pretty useless and terrible, but so is everyone else, and that's actually an existential problem, right? And what I mean by that, it's a problem that every human being has always had and always will. So it's not just you, it's a universal problem. And that there's an answer to that, and one of them is to, what does it to say? Love the sinner but hate the sin. It's something like that, is that despite the fact that you're not all that you could be, the proper attitude to have towards yourself is the attitude that you would have towards someone that you genuinely cared for. And that it's incumbent on you to act as if you genuinely care for yourself, just like you would act towards someone that you actually cared about, some other person. And so it's a reversal in some sense of the golden rule, right? And it's a discussion of why that's necessary. And also, more than that, it's a discussion of why you have a moral obligation to do that. It's not just that you should because it would be better for you. You actually have a moral obligation to do that, I think, because you make the world a much better place, a much worse place if you don't take care of yourself. So you should bloody well take care of yourself. It's partly because you have something valuable to bring into the world. That's the thing about being an individual. It's the thing that Western civilization has always recognized, that as an individual, you have a light that you have to bring into the world, and that if you don't bring it into the world is a dimmer place. And that's a bad thing, because when the world is a dim place, it can get very, very, very dark. And so it's necessary, not just so that you feel better. You need to take care of yourself because you're in the best position to do that. And it's necessary for you to take care of yourself. Despite the fact that we're mortal and vulnerable and self-conscious and capable, not only capable of doing terrible things, but actually do them. Despite all that, you still have that responsibility.
I don't think that there's a better pathway to the shadow, let's say, than resentment. If you're feeling resentful about something, there's a shadow that reveals itself in two ways. One is, it's a pointer to your immaturity. You need to be more disciplined. You have set goals, hypothetically, and if you haven't, then you're under the sway of someone else, or you're undisciplined and unintegrated and incoherent, which is all shadow life in some sense. You're pursuing short-term impulsive goals because you haven't thought it through. You're pursuing goals that other people have established for you. You're not pursuing any goals at all because you're too nihilistic to believe that life has any purpose. All that's shadowy, let's say. But maybe you have set goals and now you're resentful about all the work that you have to do in order to acquire those goals, and maybe that manifests itself as a broad-scale critique of social structure. That's immaturity, and so you can delve into that and you can find out where you're still a spoiled child and hopefully take action to rectify that. Or you may find that you're being compelled to do something that violates your integrity, and you need to stand up for yourself and say something that you don't want to say. And then you may have to learn how to incorporate your anger into your actions so that you learn how to say no when you need to say no. And so that actually means that you're furthering your ethical pursuit as a consequence of integrating your shadow rather than deviating from it. If you're without aggression and anger and incapable of it, that doesn't mean that you're on a good path and that anger knocks you off it. That can happen, but it's much more appropriate and sophisticated to note that the probability that you're going to pursue a higher good is magnified by your integration of all your emotional and motivational states, even the ones that can cause a tremendous amount of trouble when they're left to manifest themselves in isolation. You're way too agreeable. You could practice saying what you really believe, that you can take a vow to tell the truth. And that will make you much less agreeable. Agreeable people are perfectly willing to sacrifice what they know to be the case to maintain short-term social harmony. And it's not so much that they repress what they think, it's often that they don't even allow themselves to fully realize what they think. So commitment to the truth will stop an agreeable person from being a doormat. The first tack is to explore the anger. What gives rise to it? What situations give rise to it? What people give rise to it? What are you doing when it happens? And what is the phenomenology of the anger? How does it make itself manifest in image, fantasy, and thought? And then now you have an anger inventory. Is anger in this situation warranted? What steps do I have to take in order to become less angry? And sometimes that might be an adjustment of an internal psychological adjustment. Sometimes it might require changes in the world. Maybe you're in a relationship that's oppressive and you have been for a long time. And the way to fix that isn't to adjust your attitude, although it could be, but it might be that it's time to get out of the relationship. And so differentiation. When are you angry? What elicits it? Why are you angry? Who are you angry at? What are the nature of the angry thoughts? What are the nature of the angry fantasies? All of that. You have to get that out where you can see it. And you have to walk through it.
It isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate. It's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you think, well, 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion, and so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least over the course of your life, and they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. Now, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer, yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. It took me a long time to understand why there's religious injunctions supporting humility. And it means something like this. It means what you don't know is more important than what you know. Then what you don't know can start to be your friend, you see. People are very defensive about what they know, and for the reasons we've already discussed. But the thing is, you don't know enough. And you can tell you don't know enough because your life is not what it could be, and neither is the life of the people around you. You just don't know enough. And so what that means is that every time you encounter some evidence that you're ignorant, someone points it out, you should be happy about that because you think, oh, you just told me how I'm wrong. It's like, great. Like maybe I had to sift through a lot of nonsense to get through the real message that you're telling me. But if you could actually tell me some way that I'm wrong and then maybe give me a hint about how to not be wrong like that, well, then I wouldn't have to be wrong like that anymore. That would be a good thing. And you can embark on that adventure by listening to people. And if you listen to people, they'll tell you amazing things if you listen to them. And many of those things are little tools that you can put in your toolkit, like Batman, and then you can go out into the world and use those tools, and you don't have to fall blindly into a pit
quite as often. And so the humility element is, well, do you want to be right or do you want to be learning? And it's deeper than that. It's, do you want to be the tyrannical king who's already got everything figured out? Or do you want to be the continually transforming hero, or fool for that matter, who's getting better all the time? And that's actually a choice, you know. It's a deep choice. And it's better to be the self-transforming fool who's humble enough to make friends with what he or she doesn't know and to listen when people talk. And listening is a transformative exercise. Like if you listen to the people in your life, for example, if you actually listen to them, they'll tell you what's wrong with them and how to fix it and what they want. They can't even help it if you start listening, because people are so shocked if you actually listen to them that they tell you all sorts of things that they might not have even intended to, things they don't even know. And then you can work with that. And the other thing that's so interesting, you know, now and then you have a meaningful conversation, right? You have a good conversation with somebody, you walk away and you think, geez, you know what? We really connected, and I know more than I did when I came away from that conversation. And during the conversation, you're really engrossed in it. And that feeling of being engrossed is a feeling of meaning. And the feeling of meaning is engendered because you're having a transformative conversation. So your brain produces that feeling of meaning for you. It says, oh yeah, this is exactly where you should be right here and now. It's the right place and time for you. And that's a great place to occupy. And so a good conversation where people are listening has exactly that nature. And the reason it has that nature is because it is in fact transformative. One of the things young men aren't taught properly, and I mean even at the age of, let's say 11, young, is like, there is nothing that will make you more powerful than your words. And so if you think that reading and writing is for pansies and dimwits, you know, or teachers' pets, because they get in less trouble in school, let's say, you're seriously misinformed. You know, I talk to people like Jocko Willink, and Jocko's as tough a guy as you could ever hope to encounter about literacy, and a number of other people too who are also seriously tough guys. They all know perfectly well that literacy is a huge part of what's made them unstoppable. And you don't take that lightly. You know, it's really serious, and it's a failing of our education system that that literacy isn't marketed properly to young men. It's like, straighten up. Speak properly, write, learn to write. Why? Because that's the same as learning to think. And why should you think? Well, because you won't do as many stupid things and your horizons will widen. And then too, when you need to entice people along your journey, hopefully somewhere good, you'll be able to do it because you'll be compelling. And there's something deeply pathological about the way our society markets literacy to young men in particular, because, well, partly we just won't allow for let's say, the marketing association between toughness and dangerousness and literacy. There's something wrong about that, we think, some weird way, and that's wrong. It's like, sure, you should be physically tough, and you should be tough in your temperament, as well as having the capacity for play and compassion. You know, that has to be developed too. But that's not enough. And I don't care how tough you are physically, you're nowhere near as tough as you would be if you were physically tough and really literate. And then you're an unstoppable force, and hopefully for good. And that's a much tougher battle than, you know, being tough for your own idiotic, selfish ends. That's just pathetic. Get your words together and then see what you can do. And don't be thinking that that's somehow beneath you. That just means you're stupid that you think that. You don't know anything. You think that. It's wrong. And you're limiting yourself so much you can't even imagine it. You might not even figure it out till you're 60 and then it's too late. So read, write, think. Why should you read? Well, do you want to be stupid? Do you want to be stupid? What happens when you're stupid? You walk into walls because you don't see them. And if someone comes along who's more educated than you, more literate and cannier, you'll lose, man. You'll lose. And you'll lose too because you can't think properly. So you won't aim at the right things, and you won't be informed by the great individuals of the past. And you need that. We're historical creatures. This isn't optional. So why be literate? Because it helps you become who you could be. It helps you move out into the world and have your great adventure. and to bring people along. God only knows what you can do if you've got your words lined up properly. And young men would listen to that if someone who knew what they were talking about was telling them that.
We're blown hither and thither by events that are somewhat beyond our control, but that's still not the point. The point is that to a large degree, you can determine the manner in which the world manifests itself to you by changing your aim. And so then that opens up the entire domain of philosophy. You think, what good is philosophy? And people think that all the time. What good is philosophy? It's like, hey, philosophy is about value. Well, what use is value? Well, value determines your aim. Well, who cares what your aim is? Well, your aim determines the manner in which the world lays itself out to you emotionally. Well, who cares about that? No one says that. The argument stops there because no one, especially no one who's been seriously hurt or seriously depressed, like in pain, no one ever says, oh, well, who cares about that? Because if you can say that about your pain, all that means is you actually haven't been in pain. Because if you're in enough pain, you will not say that, that's for sure. So, you need to know what to aim at. Now, you aim at something, you've got a goal, and then you see that you're making progress towards the goal. That's a good thing. That makes you happy. It actually, technically, there's a system, dopamine system, neurochemical system, and it tells you that you're moving forward in the manner that you should be according to the dictates of your plan. Doesn't necessarily tell you whether you have a good plan. That's a more complicated problem, because who knows if you have a good plan. But one thing that you could know is that a plan is better than no plan. That's a really useful thing to know, especially if you're kind of drifting. It's like, well, I'm going to find myself. It's like, no, just pick something and move towards it. And as you move towards it, you're going to succeed and fail specifically. And then you're going to learn something about success specifically, and you're going to learn something about failure specifically. And then you can learn what you use to fix your plan. So a stupid plan is way better than no plan. And you're likely to have a stupid plan, or at least to be able to make one. So that's good news for everybody. You can make a stupid plan. And so I would say, make a stupid plan. And then implement it. Not any stupider than it has to be. You know, you could think about it a little bit, but then implement it. And have your successes and failures along the way, and learn from them. And then you can rejig the goal. You can move the target. That's fine. That's part of the game. It doesn't have to be fixed. It's a movable target. And maybe what you're trying to do is to move the target to an ever better place.